Chapter 3. Abandoned Shrine. At this point in life, Joe's issue was not in the least concerned about anything. He was familiar with courting death, after all, so the fisherman's vulgarity all fell on deaf ears. The boat calmly sailed across the water. On the other side of the river, a young woman called out melodiously, selling water chestnuts. "Do you want some?" It was as if time had slowed down with the river flow to a sluggish speed. "Even if I die right here, it'll be worth it," Joe's issue mused. The idea had crossed him before, back when he was in the middle of climbing the mountain of immortals in Penglai. But then he remembered that he hadn't visited Jiangnan and all of its natural beauty, so down south he had gone, and again had the thought resurfaced at this place. An unknown emotion surged up inside him. He bit into the dry and hard pie, trying his hardest to chew and swallow. Then he tilted his head side to side in contemplation. He was done traveling through Jiangnan, but there were still the 3 famous and 5 sacred mountains to see. Stopping here would be a great pity. Because of that, all thoughts about dying here were dropped. All of a sudden, as if choked on his own saliva, the fisherman stopped swearing. He bent down, head inclined to a vague direction, unblinking. Joe's issue was intrigued, so he stuck his head out from inside the boat's deck to follow the old man's gaze. He saw him scrutinizing 2 people walking by the river bank. They were the good-looking man in gray and the pretty young lady in purple he met back at the tavern. The fisherman might be old, but he was exceptionally perceptive, and when taking a closer look at him, one could see protruding temples under unruly hair, thick, strong hands and corded muscles. It was very clear there was more to him than met the eye. The pair whom old man was watching was definitely not ordinary either, seeing that they made him this on guard. The pretty girl was vivacious, but she would walk a few meters behind the man without fail, never once overstepping her boundary. A glance was enough for Joe's issue to know that this girl was either a maid or a concubine. She might have a bit of a wicked streak with a beauty he greatly appreciated, but at the end she already belonged to someone else, so he stopped thinking too much about it and withdrew his gaze, turning his attention back to tackling the dry hard pie. It was Jianghu after all. Ambiguity was one of its staples. If the royal court was a battleground for fame and power, Jianghu was a battleground between white and black. Though some were unable to understand this, and took the title of a wandering hero too seriously even until they died. But how would all this concern an incessantly ravenous homeless man like him anyway? Joe's issue felt somewhat bored after the fisherman had stopped cursing, so he goaded, "Hey old man, this pie lacks a bit of flavor. I don't mind whether it's bad or fine salt, so you should have at least put some in." The other got furious again. "How are you still talking shit with that much food stuffed in your mouth? You greedy little shit, gonna starve you for 3 days, see how you will complain then." The moment he opened his mouth, his words were a never-ending stream. Joe's issue smiled, eating his pie with more vigor, feeling a little shameless. Crossing the river only cost a few coins, but Joe's issue threw a silver crumble at the fisherman anyway. The latter didn't feel grateful or undeserved at all. He took it and walked away, face like that of an unsatisfied debt collector. He couldn't wait to kick the younger out of the boat the moment they reached the other side. Get lost, get lost. Don't waste my time, I have important business to do." Joe's issue leisurely finished the pie, stretching and leaving the deck. He replied while still chewing, "Do you have to go reincarnate or something? Why the rush?" The fisherman's eyes were as big as saucers, looking like he wanted to curse the brat's entire family and ancestors, but he swallowed his fury once he reminded himself of something, grumblingly sailing away instead. It was a good thing that this fisherman act was just a disguise for his whatever business. If he was truly one, then he would be piss poor. Staring at the boat sailing further away from sight, Joe's issue deliberately muttered a regard of absolute literary excellence, "Fuck you." For most of his life he had mingled with the cultured but degenerate side of society. All they did was spouting Confucius this and Confucius that, never did a rude word escape their mouth. He felt incredibly delighted after blurting out that curse, as if years of pent-up frustrations have vanished completely with it. And to his surprised revelation, cursing turned out to be such an enjoyable thing to do. He was all smiles, whispering once more, "Eat shit bastard, got my money and couldn't even do his job right." After mulling over the words, he felt like they tasted even sweeter, and that lifted his mood greatly. With content, he walked along the river bank. Joe's issue traveled here and there for the entire day and reached the city's outskirt at nightfall. He found a pond and had a thorough washing, because even he himself couldn't stand the smell anymore. At least he should look like a proper human. He thought about finding a place to stay overnight, and after another few hundred meters on the road, found a dilapidated and abandoned shrine. He made a bed out of hay and fell asleep at the Buddha statue's feet. In the dead of night, he was devoid of worry and could have slept dreamless till morning, had it not been for the footsteps and human noises nearby. 3 silhouettes appeared at the shrine's door with the apparent smell of blood, prompting Zhou Zishu to open his eyes and frown. The injured one was wearing a hat, supported by a boy in his teens who had some basic kung fu in him, but the energy of which was still unstable. Like a sick bull, he was in a shortage of breath, helping the injured with strenuous effort. The last person was an old woman dressed like a servant, staggering behind them with a bag in her hold. The young man walked through the door, scanning the shrine cautiously like a wounded animal. He didn't notice Zhou Zishu as the latter was hidden in the statue's casting shadow, his breath feather-light. Turning to the man with the hat, he said quietly, "Uncle Li, let's hide in here for a bit, your wound." He didn't get to finish his sentence as the one he was talking to struggled out of his assistance, trying his best to stand and made a salutation at the direction of Zhou Zishu. This friend." He trailed off after raising his head. Zhou Zishu could see clearly too, this person was the fisherman he met before. On his back was a sword wound, soaking his entire body in crimson. The younger sat up straight. "It's you." The fisherman laughed bitterly. "Damn it, of course it's the beggar brat." He stumbled forward before he could finish, and the young boy hurriedly went to support him with his arms, but since the latter himself was out of strength, both tumbled to the ground with the boy sobbing, "Uncle Li." The fisherman spasmed suddenly. Zhou Zishu couldn't help but walk over to examine the injury, noticing a strange purple color mixed in with the normal redness of blood, the effect of which being his deathly pale lips. He frowned. The old man tried his hardest to smile and spoke in a low voice, "It's not like you were shitting on your ancestors. Boy, would you stop with the tears already? I'm not even dead yet." The woman was also wiping her tears. "Old Li, what would our young master do if something happened to you?" He stared at her, inhaling with great difficulty, and told the boy, shaking, "I am just someone with no future. But I owed your father a long time ago. Apart from my own life, I have nothing else to pay this debt with." He coughed and spasmed again right after. "Young man, remember this carefully." He didn't get to tell the boy what to remember as more urgent footsteps could be heard outside the shrine. A man clad in black walked in. He didn't even bother to cover his face, on which was a scar from a knife cut. Seeing the 3 cornered like rats, his mouth twisted. "You did well, being able to escape this far." The boy bit his lips. He pulled out the sword tied around his hip, throwing himself at the man in black. "I'm gonna kill you." It was terribly unfortunate that his astonishing momentum was not backed up with enough skills. No matter how promising he looked, his execution was clumsy and showed his inexperience. He was disarmed with a flick of the hand before he could land a hit, and was knocked back a few meters after a blow to the stomach. The boy stood up after that, face covered in grime. Without fear, he shouted and charged again empty-handed. The fisherman also wanted to stand, but he was so heavily injured that he fell back right away. The enemy smiled coldly. "Look at this rabbit trying to bite." He dodged the attack, fingers crooked with the intention of clawing at the middle of the boy's back. Under the moonlight, those fingers didn't seem to be made out of human flesh and blood. They glowed a faint blue, ready to deliver the killing blow. Initially, Zhou Zishu refrained from sticking his nose into this, but he had somewhat of a fate with this fisherman, having been on the same boat with him, and the boy was too young to be met with death at his age. He took a small rock in his palm, but before he could shoot it, there was suddenly a whistle. The man in black flinched and threw himself to the flat ground, making the boy trip in midair since he caught nothing. At the place where the man in black had stood moments before was a hidden weapon in the shape of a lotus. They heard a delicate female voice. "What kind of person bullies elders and children this late at night in the middle of nowhere? How audacious!" Zhou Zishu startled as this voice was quite familiar. He withdrew the small rock, returning to his makeshift bed to watch things unfold silently. The man in black's expression twitched, gaze throbbing. Zhou Zishu thought it was because of the scar acting up. His face froze, looking a little funny despite the viciousness. He spoke angrily, "Show yourself, you whore." The young lady appeared at the door, smiling. Zhou Zishu recognized her as the one in purple who had threatened to poison him earlier. What a roll he was on today, seeing that half of the people gathered here was someone he had run into beforehand. The girl's master was nowhere to be found. She tilted her head, leaning on the door with an innocent expression, a finger lightly scraping her face. Old shameless bastard, how dare you come here to attack elders and children, not sparing even one who's at death's door? At being called one who's at death's door, the fisherman, having been swearing up and down vigorously just hours before, collapsed in silence. Chapter 4. The Chivalrous. The man in black and the girl quickly engaged in a fight. As an outsider, Joe's issue had a good look at their capability. The movements were not quite the same, but the ruthlessness from both was definitely on the same level. They didn't appear to be from righteous orthodox sects. After about 14 to 15 moves, the man suddenly staggered back to dodge, kicking at her chanson point. She leaned away and made a soft noise, concentrating on her next attack, which apparently was cracking down on the enemy's knees. But she didn't expect a noise from something hidden above the man's pants, and from it a spring ejected, shooting an arrow forward, aiming it at the girl's chin. She was not half bad, currently having an upper hand in this fight even, but never could she have predicted this vile move. Panic piled up, but dodging at this point was futile. The rock in Joe's issue's hand was finally useful as he flicked it straight toward the incoming arrow, deflecting its course. It ended up narrowly grazing the girl's temple. After experiencing danger, a normal person would feel terrified, but apparently she was the opposite, her embarrassment turning into anger. She surged forward and made a clawing attack without hesitation, gripping at the enemy's leg bone and twisting it. The man screamed as his leg was broken, but his attacker didn't stop there. In her hand was a glowing blue light, and she ruthlessly pounded it into the man's chest, knocking him backwards, both legs bent and crushed. His face immediately turned gray and purple as he stared at the girl with wide eyes, pointing at her. "You're pure purple." He died before he could finish. The old woman was frightened to death by this beautiful but cruel young lady. Contrastingly, the simple-minded looking boy had a faster reaction. He threw himself at the fisherman, asking hurriedly, "Uncle Lee, how are you?" "You." He still had a breath left in him. With all his strength, he caught the boy's sleeves. The latter tried to embrace him and help him stand. The girl in purple walked over, lifting the old man's eyelids, frowning. "It's the 3 gang until death poison. He's beyond saving now. My condolences." The boy threw her hands off, glowering. He shouted at her, "Stop saying nonsense." Her brows raised, murderous intent resurfacing on her smiling expression. But she suppressed it after remembering something, arms crossed in front of her chest with a sneer. "You little puppy can't even see between good and bad." The fisherman only looked at her for a brief moment. He scanned over everyone, finally stopping at Joe's issue, who was standing at the statue's feet, 2 straws sticking out of his head, making a laughable sight of himself. The old man turned to him, about to say something. Everyone's gaze followed his. The girl laughed. "Ah. I was just wondering who my benevolent savior was. Can't believe it's you. I bought you wine, you helped me fight, so we're even." She spoke as if those two things could ever be equal, but Joe's issue wouldn't stoop as low as to argue with a pretty girl. He smiled, walking over to the old man, squatting down. "You calling me, old chap?" The fisherman said, I'll return your silver. Your boat ride was free, you must help. Help me." Joe's issue didn't wait for him to continue, shaking his head and reluctantly stood up, but the old man's grip on his wrist was unwavering. "Help me. Bring this child to Taihu Holdings of the Zhao family." He was nowhere near a beautiful lady, so Joe's issue sighed. "Listen, old man." He was interrupted. "Small favor should be repaid with big gratitude." Joe's issue raised his head, sullenly looking at this shrine in ruins in the middle of nowhere. He thought about the possibility of changing his face again, as this one still didn't look sickly enough. How else people are thinking he's that benevolent to agree to these favors? The fisherman seemed to be in his final moment, his grip ever stronger but his breath faint and weak in his throat. He faltered, "Consider this a way to accumulate your own merits, please. For your descendants. Even if you die and have no offspring. There's still your next life." Those words hit him like a lightning strike, and the nails on his chest acted up again, as if wanting to sink even further into the flesh. There's still your next life. Your sins this lifetime will be paid in full with your death in 3 years, but there's still the next life to look forward to, right? After a long while, Joe's issue sighed, turning over the silver crumble a few times in his palm and putting it back in his breast pocket. The fisherman's hazy eyes brightened, his lips trembled. Then the light in his eyes slowly dimmed, hand loosening its grip on Joe's issues and hanging down limply. He still seemed to rattle on about something, though. Joe's issue put his ears closer to the elder's mouth, hearing him mutter brokenly, "You must have two. If you don't, I'll haunt 18 generations. Your ancestors." Joe's issue sat back, truly at a loss for words as the fisherman drew his last breath, head lolled to one side. Gut-wrenching sobs tore through the young boy's chest. The old woman in servant clothes also drew a blank as she stood next to him, crying in panic. Joe's issue and the girl in purple stood to one side. The girl's big eyes wandered, and her voice was quiet. "Master said you're more than you appear to be, but I didn't really see it before. Which sect are you from? What's your name?" Joe's issue graciously replied, "This incompetent one is Joe. Joe Shu, just a lonely vagrant traveling everywhere. Actually, I haven't had the honor of knowing your name, young miss." She looked him up and down, shaking her head. "If you didn't look like a sick ghost and walk and talk like that, you would sound more like how masters described. I'm Gu Xiang." She had never heard of a Joe Shu before. Besides, they only met by chance. There were no reasons to be entirely truthful with each other. But she didn't mind it much, patting the young boy on the shoulder. "Say, he's passed away already. You should get him a proper burial. Are there more people chasing after you?" Still annoyed by her bluntness earlier, he only glared. The grief and anger brimmed inside him had no way to be relieved, so he directed it all at her as if she was the one who caused the murder. Gu Xiang raised a brow. This girl had the skills but still not quite the age, in addition to the feel of an unorthodox martial artist she exuded. Having enough with the boy taking his anger out on her, she raised her hand with the intention of attack, but catching her off guard was Joe's issue's interception. Gu Xiang felt an ice-cold hand gently wrapped around her wrist. The grip was completely painless and its culprit didn't even seem to have put any strength into it, but she was unable to either move or yank herself away. She couldn't help but give this ill-looking man an astounded look, thinking, "Master highly respected this one, but he's even more mysterious than I thought. Not sure I would succeed were I ever to attack him." Changing her mind as she was a smart one who knew her own limits, she retracted her hands, smirking at Joe's issue, just doing it out of respect for him. Then she turned to the young boy and began scolding, "See, little brat, this sister is only passing by, and she helps you out of pity for your situation, so don't even look at her like she murdered your entire family or something. Try and avenge him if you want relief that much. How nice of you to only know how to cry over a dead body and bully this good, patient sister." This girl might be clever, but she certainly wasn't kind. Joe's issue, for lack of better options, was about to console him briefly, but to his surprise, the boy, after being stupefied by her words, suddenly wiped away the tears with all his might and knelt down. He audibly banged his head into the ground twice, voice tiny, "You were right to educate me, miss, I have greatly wronged you." He looked a little more sharp-edged with his teeth gritted way too tight, stretching out his face muscles. In contrast, Gu Xiang was dumbfounded, retreating half a step, blinking her large almond eyes. "I didn't say that to make you kneel to me. Just stand up, quickly." Joe's issue bent down a little to help him stand without the boy even noticing. He suggested, "First we should have a burial for old brother Lee. He trusted me to take care of things, so I'm gonna escort you on your journey. But if you two are not in a hurry, you can rest here for a bit and tell me what happened." The boy muttered his assent, so Joe's issue helped him find a place behind the shrine to bury the old man. Gu Xiang, after observing and finally feeling her heart stir, brought them a piece of wood, pulling out a dagger around her waist to carve it into a simple headstone. "What's his name?" she asked. The boy thought about it for a bit before shaking his head. "He only told us his last name's Lee, and that he owed my father something, so he risked his life to help us escape. I just call him Uncle Lee. I don't really know what his real name was." Joe's issue exhaled. "People in Zhonghu repay debts and exact vengeance as they see fit. Is there ever a need to leave a name?" Gu Xiang had her head down, engraving for Uncle Lee the chivalrous on the wooden headstone. She looked it over, giving to Joe's issue once satisfied. "What do you think?" Joe's issue saw the word uncle missing a stroke the moment he glanced at it, feeling both amused and sorrowful. He added the missing stroke with his finger before putting it in front of the simple grave. The young boy knelt down, kowtowing 3 times while trying to quell down the tears. Then he stood up, his back straight,